What if Iran's most dangerous weapon in the Strait of Hormuz isn't a missile, a mine, or a drone? What if it's something much harder to defend against? Because Iran doesn't need to sink a tanker to disrupt global shipping. A captain only has to hesitate. An insurer only has to raise the price. A shipping company only has to decide that crossing Hormuz has become too risky. And suddenly, Iran can create the economic effect of a blockade without having to declare one. But there's a problem with that strategy. The United States may be attacking the one thing that makes the threat work in the first place. High above the Gulf, American aircraft are watching the electromagnetic battlefield, listening for radars, communications, and signals that could reveal what Iran is seeing, where it is looking, and how its defenses are reacting. And one aircraft is built almost perfectly for this mission, the EA-18G Growler. It isn't simply there to shoot. Its real advantage may come from knowing what Iran is doing before Iran knows that America knows. And that creates a much bigger question. What exactly are those American aircraft hearing over the strait? And what happens when Iran realizes its defenses are no longer invisible? Because if the United States can turn Iran's electronic battlefield into a map, the fight over Hormuz may already be changing before the next missile is ever launched. The Strait of Hormuz matters because geography gives Iran an unusual source of leverage. The waterway connects the Persian Gulf with the Gulf of Oman and the wider Arabian Sea, making it a critical route for energy and commercial shipping. Iran sits directly alongside it with naval, missile, drone, and surveillance capabilities that can threaten traffic and raise the perceived risk of passage. Tehran does not necessarily need to physically stop every ship to create economic pressure. If enough operators believe the route has become dangerous, ships can be delayed, rerouted, or subjected to higher insurance costs. That is the power of uncertainty. And this is exactly where the American response becomes interesting. The U.S. advantage is not simply the number of aircraft or warships it can deploy. It is the ability to combine surveillance, communications, electronic warfare, air power, and maritime forces into a wider information network. The objective is not necessarily to eliminate every Iranian weapon. It is to reduce the uncertainty surrounding them. The more accurately American forces can determine what Iranian systems are doing, where they are operating, and how they are behaving, the less freedom those systems may have to surprise or intimidate other forces. And one aircraft is particularly important to understanding that invisible contest, the EA-18G Growler. At first glance, the Growler looks like another member of the Super Hornet family, but its specialty is electronic warfare. Instead of relying primarily on physical destruction, it is designed to operate in the electromagnetic environment, detecting, analyzing, and potentially interfering with electronic systems. Modern military forces depend heavily on radar, communications, data links, navigation, and other systems that generate or depend on electromagnetic signals. Those signals can reveal information about how a system operates. And when you can identify patterns, you can begin building a picture of the electronic battlefield. Think about it this way. Imagine entering a completely dark building. You cannot see the rooms or the people inside, but every time someone turns on a flashlight, you can detect where the light came from. After enough observations, you begin to understand the building. You learn where activity is concentrated. You learn which areas are active. You learn patterns. Electronic warfare works within that broader logic. The invisible environment becomes a source of intelligence. And that matters enormously around Hormuz. Iran's air defenses and surveillance systems exist partly to detect threats, but using those systems can also reveal information about them. A radar that becomes active is potentially detectable. A communications network generates signals. A repeated operating pattern can become recognizable. None of this means an American aircraft automatically knows everything or can instantly defeat an Iranian system. Electronic warfare is complicated, contested, and highly dependent on circumstances. But the fundamental advantage is information, knowing more about the environment before making the next decision. That leads to the central question of this entire confrontation. What happens when Iran's strategy depends on uncertainty, but the United States becomes better at reducing it? Imagine a tanker approaching the region. The crew does not need to know whether an Iranian missile will definitely be launched. They need to assess the probability of an attack. The shipping company needs to calculate whether the voyage is worth the risk. The insurer needs to price that risk. Governments need to decide whether additional protection is necessary. If American surveillance and maritime security measures can make the environment more predictable, Iran's ability to create fear through uncertainty becomes harder to translate into economic leverage. That does not mean the United States has solved Hormuz. It has not. Geography has not changed. Iran still possesses military capabilities that could threaten shipping. Missiles, drones, naval forces, mines, and other asymmetric options remain part of the strategic equation. The strait remains narrow, and any serious confrontation could produce consequences far beyond the immediate battlefield. The important point is that American capabilities can change the calculation without eliminating the underlying danger. This is also why electronic warfare is so important. Its most valuable contribution may happen before anyone fires a weapon. If an aircraft can help identify a radar, understand an electronic signature, detect a change in activity, or support a broader operational picture, that information can influence what other forces do next. A fighter may know where to look. A naval vessel may receive better situational awareness. Commanders may have more time to react. And forces that understand the environment better are generally harder to surprise. This creates an uncomfortable problem for Iran. The more predictable its military activity becomes, the harder it may be to rely on surprise. But keeping every sensor silent is not a perfect solution either. An air defense system that cannot detect threats cannot perform its defensive mission effectively. Communications that are constantly restricted can make coordination harder. Military systems have to balance concealment with usefulness. That is one of the fundamental tensions of modern electronic warfare, and the battle is not being fought by the Growler alone. Different aircraft and naval platforms can contribute different capabilities: surveillance, air defense, strike, communications, rescue, or maritime security. The important thing is the network connecting those capabilities. A single platform may have limited information. Multiple platforms sharing information can create a much broader picture. That is where modern military power becomes more than a collection of individual weapons. But there is another side to the equation: economics. A prolonged confrontation is expensive for everyone involved. Aircraft require maintenance, ships require fuel, air defense systems require support, infrastructure requires protection and repair. Iran is also dealing with long-standing economic pressures, including sanctions and inflation. Those pressures do not prove that the Iranian government is collapsing, and they do not mean its military capability has disappeared, but they reduce the room available for policymakers when multiple demands compete for resources. That creates a difficult calculation. Money may be needed to support the currency and civilian economy. It may be needed for energy and infrastructure. It may be needed for military operations, missile programs, drones, naval forces, and internal security. The longer a confrontation continues, the more those priorities compete with one another. That does not automatically produce political collapse. It does, however, make strategic choices more difficult. And there is an even deeper problem. Every confrontation produces information. A radar activation can reveal a pattern. A missile launch can reveal characteristics. A drone operation can expose tactics. A communications event can provide another piece of the puzzle. Over time, repeated behavior can become easier to recognize. That is why electronic warfare is not simply about what happens during one mission. It is also about what can be learned over dozens of missions. The first time an unfamiliar signal appears, it may be a mystery. Later, analysts may recognize it. Eventually, a pattern may become familiar enough to influence future decisions. This is why information can become a form of military power. The side that understands the environment faster can potentially act faster. But this also creates one of the most dangerous possibilities in the entire region: miscalculation. A drone approaches a ship. A radar detects an aircraft. A commander interprets an ambiguous signal as hostile. A defensive system activates. Another side sees that activation and assumes an attack is coming. One decision triggers another. And suddenly, a confrontation that neither side intended to escalate begins moving faster than political leaders can control. That is why surveillance is not only about preparing for war, it can also be about preventing surprises. Knowing what is happening can give commanders more time to distinguish between a deliberate attack, a provocation, an accident, or a misunderstanding. In a region this tense, even a few extra minutes of information can matter. And this brings us back to the strait itself. The real question is not simply whether Iran can threaten ships. It clearly has capabilities that can create serious risks. The question is whether Tehran can turn those capabilities into sustained control over maritime traffic. That is much harder, because control is not the same as possession. Iran can sit beside the strait, it can threaten the waterway, it can raise the perceived cost of using it. But if ships continue moving, if maritime forces can monitor the environment, if surveillance reduces uncertainty, and if alternative arrangements remain available, then the economic leverage created by fear becomes harder to sustain. There may be no explosion, no burning ship, no spectacular missile launch. Instead, somewhere above the water, an aircraft may be collecting information. Somewhere at sea, a crew may be monitoring a threat picture. Somewhere in an operations center, analysts may be comparing today's electronic activity with yesterday's. And those invisible decisions can determine what happens next. That is what makes the EA-18G Growler so interesting. Its value is not simply measured by how many weapons it fires. Its value can also come from what it helps other forces understand. In a confrontation where detection, communication, deception, and reaction time are critical, information can shape the battlefield before the battlefield becomes visible. So is the United States changing the rules of Hormuz? Potentially, but not because America has made the strait safe or removed Iran's ability to cause disruption. The change is more subtle. The contest is increasingly about whether Iran can create enough uncertainty to influence the behavior of everyone around it, and whether American surveillance, electronic warfare, maritime protection, and military presence can reduce that uncertainty. If they can, Iran's leverage becomes harder to convert into economic pressure. If they cannot, the strait remains one of the world's most dangerous strategic choke points. And that is why the aircraft flying above the Gulf may matter more than they appear to. They are not simply watching the water. They are trying to understand the invisible battlefield around it, because the side that sees first may gain the time to decide first. And in a crisis where one mistake could turn a maritime confrontation into a regional war, that time may be the most valuable weapon of all. The Strait of Hormuz has always been a choke point, but the next phase of the struggle may be about something even more fundamental. Who gets to decide what everyone else believes is safe? If you want more deeply researched geopolitical analysis that separates what is known from what is possible, subscribe to the channel. Because in modern warfare, the biggest shift is often the one you cannot see until it is already changing the battlefield.